Our gospel reading for this morning comes from the 5th chapter of Mark. It is one of several occasions where this gospel writer likes to weave two stories together. It brackets the beginning and the end of one story around a different story, and it allows the two stories to interact with one another. In this particular story, we will hear a couple of times the term made well. That's a perfectly valid translation of the word used in the Greek, but it's also the very same word that in other places is translated saved. It's a big, thick word that means made well, made whole, saved, rescued. And so all of those things are there, but when we translate it, we kind of flatten the word out. So I will point that out as we go through the reading. Listen now for what the Spirit may speak to us through these words. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well, saved, and live." So he went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had. And she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For, she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well, saved." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you ask, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well, has saved you. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. And he took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was about 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that they should say nothing to anyone about this, and told them to give her something to eat. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Jairus was an important man well-off and influential. People cultivated friendships with him, took him out for expensive dinners. He rode in a black SUV, often accompanied by a security detail, and could always get a seat in the best restaurant. Some of us know people like Jairus. All of us know who people like Jairus are. We're well aware of them. When my wife and I recently flew to Austin, there was a well-known politician on the flight with us, and when we landed, all us regular folk had to remain seated until she had departed the airplane. I could look out my window and see the motorcade underneath the wing. Jairus got treated like that. The woman with the hemorrhage is unimportant. Her name didn't matter, and Mark doesn't even bother to tell it to us. She's simply a nameless, faceless member of one of those groups that usually start with the poor, the sick, the uninsured, the homeless, the stranger, the foreigner. But things were even worse for this woman. This woman, not only had she been sucked dry and left bankrupt by the healthcare system, but she bore a terrible, horrible religious stigma. Her constant menstrual bleeding meant that she was ritually impure, unclean. She could not go to the synagogue. She could not go to public events. And this had been going on for 12 long years. And so even if people didn't know her name, they knew to avoid her. Jairus and this woman live in completely different worlds. They could not be more different from one another. And yet the gospel writer weaves their stories into one another. Jairus comes directly up to Jesus. The great crowd is no barrier to him. People move out of the way as Jairus approaches Jesus. And he's used to people being deferential to him and showing him respect and honor, but right now Jairus is a desperate man. His daughter is dying, and he's heard of this rabbi who can heal, and so he throws himself at Jesus' feet. He begs. No one in the crowd is surprised when Jesus immediately goes with Jairus. Jairus and his security detail and Jesus head towards the house. The woman with the hemorrhage dares not approach Jesus directly. She's not about to risk speaking to him or telling of her disease. If Jesus finds out she's unclean, he may shun her. And so she decides she will sneak a healing by coming up and touching his clothes. Jesus is in a hurry to help an important person. He'll never notice, and even if he does, he's in a hurry. The plan works up to a point. She touches Jesus, and she can immediately tell that her long years of suffering are over. Oh, how wonderful. And she turns and begins to slip out of the crowd. But Jesus wheels around. Who touched my clothes? What an absurd question, as the disciples are quick to point out. There's a great crowd all around him, bumping and jostling. Who hasn't touched him? And then there's Jairus, whose daughter could die at any moment. Why is Jesus delaying? But he stands there, looking out over the crowd, seeking this one who has snuck a healing from him. Realizing that she's been found out, the woman comes toward Jesus, forced to do what she had tried to avoid. Like Jairus, now she drops at Jesus' feet and tells her story. The gospel says, she told him the whole truth. Does that mean that she told him all about her disease and the 12 years and being broken and bankrupt by the healthcare system? If so, imagine Jairus standing there, waiting, wondering, why is Jesus spending all this time listening to the life story of some nameless, unknown, unimportant woman? Daughter, your faith has made you well, saved you. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. She's already been healed, but Jesus makes it official. It isn't snuck or stolen. Jesus gives it to her, along with his blessing and the designation daughter. Daughter. Not one of the poor or the sick, but beloved daughter, child of God, restored member of the community. Jairus looks on anxiously, impatiently, perhaps angrily, as Jesus enacts the priorities of the gospel of God's new day. And these priorities are upside down compared to those of the world. Important people like Jairus have to wait while Jesus makes time for, reclaims and restores and heals and listens, invites the telling of the life story of an unimportant, nameless person, says she is saved, made well, and calls her daughter. Jairus and his own daughter, who not coincidentally has been alive exactly the same amount of time as this woman has suffered, are not forgotten. But in the priorities of the kingdom, people like Jairus do not come at the first of the line, they're at the last. Jesus, God, has compassion for all, but the poor, the sick, the broken, the marginalized, the oppressed, the immigrant, the stranger, are the objects of special divine concern. There's a TV commercial running, I think it's still on now, for an investment firm. And in this commercial, all the people in the commercial have these big tags that they wear around their neck that have the amount that's in their retirement fund. And one woman with a relatively small number on her tag sits in a brokerage office. She sits and she watches and she waits as people who come in after her get attended to while she waits because their number is bigger. The commercial works because we all know exactly what it's talking about. But the good news of Jesus is upside down and backwards to this. The first are last and the last are first. Those who are rich, those who have the most, says Jesus, have the hardest time becoming a part of God's new day. On one occasion, some of Jesus' disciples are arguing with one another about which of them is the greatest. And Jesus tells them that to be great means to be last of all and a servant of all. And then he takes a small child, brings it into the middle of them, and he picks it up and he holds it and says, "Whoever welcomes one such child welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." Now, children were viewed very differently in Jesus' day. Especially young children were about as unimportant and inconsequential as you could get. They were at the absolute bottom of the social pecking order. But Jesus says to see one such child as important is to see Jesus. And so if you're ever tempted to think that because you're unimportant or not good enough or haven't been a church member long enough or don't give enough money or volunteer enough, that somehow God has less concern for you, remember, God orders things quite backwards and upside down from how we do. And if you're ever tempted to think that someone doesn't deserve your care or compassion or embrace because they're unimportant, an addict or an alcoholic from the wrong social group, not long-time members of the church like you, from the wrong political party, an immigrant or a foreigner, or part of any group that you somehow deem to be bad, trouble, problem. If you ever think someone doesn't deserve a place at the table, remember, God's guest list is ordered very differently from yours and mine. Thanks be to God.